Okay, it appears that we are now live, so welcome to all who are attending the regular meeting of council for Tuesday, September the 7th. Getting close to the last meeting. Hard to believe. There are no public questions. I'll call the meeting to order. Are there any additions or changes to the agenda?
There are no additions or changes from administration.
In which case, I'll move the agenda be approved as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. We have no delegations. Looking then to the minutes of the August 17th regular meeting of council, are there errors or omissions? Seeing none, I'll move they be adopted as presented. Those in favor and opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And we'll jump right into item G1, a committee bylaw amendment.
Good morning.
Ms. Brown.
I'm just going to share, we're back to Zoom, so I'm just going to share my screen.
Yeah, kind of disappointing, isn't it?
Yeah, I was hoping to see everybody in person this morning, but we can't get everything we want as long as everybody's safe.
Close. We came close.
My apologies, Cheryl, it doesn't seem to be letting me share. Normally it's very obvious. Am I able to?
What's happening when you press your share?
Here we go. Thank you. It just was not showing up the way I thought it would. My apologies for that.
Okay.
We're all a little rusty on this Zoom thing, huh?
How sad is that? We've been doing it for such a long time. All right. Can everybody see this okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. My goodness, Zoom's popping up a million things right now. So, good morning, Mayor, members of council. I'm here today to amend our committee bylaw eligibility criteria to be more inclusive and welcoming. So, in Canmore, our boards and committees provide our elected officials with advice and assistance in decision making. And it's important that these boards and committees invite community-minded volunteers and welcome all residents to participate. Amending our committee bylaw is a key step in becoming a more welcoming and inclusive community. Becoming a welcoming and inclusive community is a journey, not a decision, not a destination. There's no clear endpoint. Instead, we work with our community partners through a partnership called Bow Valley Immigration Partnership to identify key areas of focus and next steps for creating a more inclusive and welcoming Bow Valley. The town of Canmore is one of 60 community representatives that collectively work together as the Bow Valley Immigration Partnership, also known as BVIP. Collectively, as members, we approved an integration strategy that outlines key areas that the Bow Valley as a whole needs to focus on to create a more inclusive and welcoming community. In June, Ms. Reed, the BVIP program coordinator, shared this strategy with council. Ms. Reed outlined 4 areas of work that BVIP adopted in their 2019-2023 integration strategy. And this includes workforce development, political engagement, community resident, welcoming attitudes and behavior, civic and political engagement, and community readiness. My apologies on that. BVIP is collectively working on all areas of the integration strategy, but today's request for decision focuses on civic and political engagement. The goal of civic and political engagement is to ensure that leadership of our community reflects our diversity and that new Canadians are full and equal participants in the political landscape. With these goals in mind, I'm here today to recommend that council amend the committee residency requirement to include Canadian citizens, refugees, temporary foreign workers, and permanent residents by making the default eligibility requirement for all committees to be resident of Canmore and a minimum age of 18 years of age. It is important to note that council will continue to have its discretion and modify or augment these requirements to suit mandates for specific committees. In addition, research shows that individuals who have been historically excluded from processes are more willing and comfortable with participating in given processes if there's an explicit invitation. As such, administration will also include inviting language in our committee advertisement. And here's an example of what this might look like. So this slide says the town of Canmore is committed to inclusion and equity. We invite applicants from people of all backgrounds and will consider a variety of types of experience, training, or evidence of skills when assessing qualifications. And this, again, is just an example. So I will finish today with a recommended council motion that council give first, second, and third reading to Community Events Committee Bylaw, Subdivision and Development Appeal Board Bylaw, and the Development Authority Bylaw Amendment 2021-2019 eligibility requirement. Thank you for your time. Can I answer any of your questions?
Well, thanks very much, Ms. Brown, for the presentation and for considering this and developing it as a request to council. I think it's commendable. I think we should have been talking about this some time ago, but thanks for bringing this forward. I don't have any specific questions. The report is quite straightforward. Looking to other members of council to see Councillor Comfort.
So thank you for your report, Ms. Brown. I just was wondering, what if this was Canmore was a second home? Would somebody be able to then participate as a second homeowner, or is there something that we need to add to the bylaw wording that would restrict somebody? I'm just thinking about, I read a news story about a group of second homeowners down in the States in Butte, Colorado, who had gotten together and they had 4 more people than the actual resident population, and we're going to start transforming the community. So it just sort of twigged something, and so I wondered about that.
So right now, and Ms. Hyde, please correct me if this is unclear, but right now it's only, committees will only consider second home if we add that exception into that bylaw. So that's the discretion that council has. So for instance, the community grants bylaw does include second homeowners, but many of them don't.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, the individual bylaws themselves are specific if necessary. So the bylaw 2017-33, which, as Ms. Brown noted, is actually the Community Events Committee bylaw. Under 6.1b, it notes that to be eligible, one must be a resident of or a second homeowner in Canmore. And so that has been addressed in these 3 separate bylaws. Did that answer your question, Councillor Comfort?
It did, yes.
Are there questions from other members of council? Seeing none, thanks very much for being here today, Ms. Brown. With that, I will move the council give first reading to Community Events Committee Bylaw, Subdivision and Development Appeal Board Bylaw and Development Authority Bylaw, Amendment 2021-19, eligibility requirement. Councillor McCallum is joined. And if Councillor McCallum and Comfort could just mute themselves, that would probably be helpful. Thanks. So on the question to give first reading to the motion, those in favor?
Wait, John?
And opposed?
No,
Sorry, Mayor Board.
Councillor Hillstead?
I have an amending motion for
Oh, go ahead.
this. Mrs. Hyde can throw that up on the screen.
I thought you were just getting ahead of the
No,
vote.
I was, waiting for debate. You just skipped it. Yeah, so just like council amend section 3, bylaw 2021-19 by striking out section 6.1a and substituting section 13a, just as we amended the SDAB bylaw at our last meeting. So it has different numbering now. So that needs to be changed. So it actually amends the right section.
Section 3 of bylaw. Okay, so it's just catching an error in the bylaw itself, the wording of. Okay, thanks very much, Councillor. Is there any discussion on the amending motion? Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Mayor Barman. And just a point of order question, since I just arrived in the middle of the presentation or at the end of the presentation, am I permitted to vote? I have read the agenda item and understand the request being made by administration.
Ms. Hyde, do you have a ruling on that?
Yes, so according to the MGA, Councillor McCallum, you must vote if you're present unless there's something in the act that excuses you from voting, and there's no requirement for you to be present for the presentation and Q&A before you vote.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Great, thanks for clearing that up. So we have an amending motion from Councillor Hillstead on the table. Discussion on the amending motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Back then to the primary motion as amended, that council give first reading to Community Events Committee Bylaw, Subdivision and Development Appeal Board Bylaw, and Development Authority Bylaw, Amendment 2021-19, eligibility requirement. Further, is there discussion on that motion as amended? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And then move the council give a second reading to the Community Events Committee Bylaw, Subdivision and Development Appeal Board Bylaw, and the Development Authority Bylaw Amendment 2021-19, eligibility requirement. Discussion on that motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously, and I'll move the council go to third reading of the bylaw. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And then I will give, move the council give third reading of Community Events Committee Bylaw, Subdivision and Development Appeal Board Bylaw, and Development Authority Bylaw Amendment 2021-19, eligibility requirement. Discussion on that motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor and opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Thank you very much. We'll move on then to item H1, the Heliport location study. Mr. Hannes.
Mr. Hannes is on vacation this week, so.
Well, Ms. Smithers then.
All right, I will share my screen and try to do Mr. Hannes justice. All right, so I believe you're looking at the right screen there.
Yes.
Okay, so good morning, Mayor Borman and members of council. Excuse me. I'm here to present to you today on the Heliport location study. As you will recall, when administration brought the revised Heliport lease forward to council for a decision, Mayor Borman directed that administration report back at today's meeting with a project description and a budget to work with Alpine Helicopters to look at possible locations within the municipality or close to the town of Canmore, either to relocate the heliport or have a staging pad for sightseeing flights, and that motion was passed unanimously. So accordingly, the purpose of the study that we put a scope together for was to evaluate lands that would be suitable for a new heliport or a secondary site, and to confirm whether the relocation of the heliport would be an option. So in terms of a project description, the study that we, the way that we have structured the study, we would look at two phases to it. The first would be to develop some site selection and design criteria, confirm the study area around and including the town of Canmore, and then do a desktop review of preliminary identified sites. The second phase would identify the top sites coming out of that desktop review. We would do some on-site assessments, get an opinion on anticipated noise levels, put some work together on high-level cost estimates for developing the staging area or new heliport at different locations. get an estimate of operational requirements for the new heliport or the staging area, and then also put together an outline of any regulatory or zoning considerations or anything else that we would need to consider to move forward with such a proposal. So that's just the scope of what we would look at, and the estimated cost for undertaking that work would be about $75,000. So our recommendation today for council is that council direct administration to present this report on the heliport location study as part of the finance committee deliberations on the upcoming 2022 capital budget. And that is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks very much, Ms. Smithers. I didn't look it up in the minutes, but my recollection was that original motion was carried unanimously.
Yes,
Anybody?
it was.
Yeah. In the report itself, it notes that under stakeholder engagement, the scope of the study was developed with feedback solicited from both Alpine helicopters and industry expertise. I wonder if you could share with me who or what bodies would have been those covered by an industry expertise.
I can't give you specifics as it was Mr. Hannes that did that work, but it was consultants with expertise in the area of aviation.
Okay, so both Alpine helicopters were consulted and other informed people from that are not associated with Alpine helicopter.
Correct. So the industry experts we would have been looking to their insights or advice on putting together a study like this from a technical and regulatory perspective. And then Alpine was involved in terms of their input on impacts on operational requirements if the heliport was relocated or split into effectively two different areas.
Great, thanks very much. And I will note that with this motion, if it's carried, this project would then be added to future finance committee deliberations. Arguably, in a future time, council could not move forward with this study as a part of the 2022 capital budget. Just noting that as an observation.
Yes, that's so our recommendation, excuse me, just some water. Our recommendation would be that council consider it as part of that 2022 budget deliberations. If they decided, if the next council chose to go ahead with this, it would be a new capital project in 2022, the study. Right. And then that would obviously come forward with ongoing costs for land acquisition and site development, et cetera, if the choice was to go forward with a new.
Right. Okay, thanks very much for speaking to the report. Are there any questions from members of council? Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. Could you tell me or explain confirming the search area limit from the town of Canmore municipal boundaries? So are we trying to site this heliport in such a way that we're optimizing the 5 kilometers from the municipal boundaries? I'm not understanding that statement.
Yeah, so 5 kilometers, a 5 kilometer radius from the town was suggested as an initial point of reference, but we would just want to confirm that because we haven't done the work. I mean, the recommendation is for us, for the future council to make. But it was a starting point for an area around the town, and it may be, as we look into it, that there are parts of the surrounding area where we would want a greater area to be captured to give us more opportunities or not. So the confirming the radius is just validating that is a logical distance from the town to be exploring.
Yeah, in our initial motion, council only directed review possible locations either within the municipality or close proximity, and we didn't define what close proximity might mean. So now administration has added some more specific detail to understand what is meant by close proximity.
Okay, I thought the siting of the heliport was the close proximity part, but they're talking about the search area limit here. So that would exclude a lot of parks areas that would be the search area limit. That's what I'm understanding.
Well, and that's why we want to confirm the 5 kilometers. We put it out there as a starting point, and then when we assess what lands would be included or excluded from that limit, we may want to move it. So it's just it's one of that, it's a step in that preliminary investigation to determine and refine that study area.
Okay, thank you.
Further questions at this time from Ms. Smithers? Councillor Hillstead?
Thank you, Mayor Borman. So one of the out of scope items, acoustical study of existing heliport. Do we know how much roughly that would be to bring that in scope, like just from number wise? And if not, would we be able to at least find out, or for the future council to find out for the next finance committee, just so that if they want to bring in acoustical study of the existing heliport within the scope, it's because right now it's an out of scope item.
So I'm just looking at the acoustical study of the existing heliport. We could absolutely look at putting a cost estimate on that and including it in what comes forward to the next finance committee. Yeah, I don't have that number off the top of my head, and I'm not sure if Mr. Hannes would have it.
Yep. Thank you. That's all.
So that would be beyond what was intended by the original motion?
Yes, it would be. So this was really about the clarity around the out of scope items was really to focus in on the looking for future or new sites. It's not an examination or a re-examination of the existing site. So that's why.
Right. Yeah, that was the intent.
Yeah, so even if we included it in the study, it wouldn't really add value to the study itself because it's about future sites, not referencing the existing one.
Correct. Councillor Hillstead?
Yeah, just to that point, like to me, I just feel an acoustical study of the existing would actually help because it would give us a kind of a ballpark of where we're at currently. So it just gives something to go against to the next site. So if we find out that the next site's actually worse acoustically, it gives you that reference point because we already know the issues we're facing with our current one. So if we know the acoustical study for that one, it can help show us if we're actually finding a better site or a worse site. It just, in my mind, that just gives a baseline for kind of what we're looking at. So, but again, that's for future council to figure out.
Okay. Are there other questions from council for Ms. Smithers? Seeing none, thanks very much to be here to present this report. And with that, I will move the council direct administration to present this report on the heliport location study as part of the Finance Committee deliberations on the 2022 capital budget. Discussion on that motion. Councilor Comfort, you have your hand up, I think. And you're muted.
I'm trying to make it go away.
Okay. Looks like you're just waving.
There we go.
Well, I'll ignore it for now. Okay, so motion's on the table. Is there any discussion to the motion? Councillor Seeley?
Thank you, Mayor Borman. I will support this motion. It's been an important community issue, and reviewing possible new locations and a staging area for sightseeing tours makes sense. So I do support it.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor and opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on then to item H2, the bus barn expansion project budget amendment. Mr. Asarte. Or anyone for that matter.
Mayor Borman, I don't see Mr. Asarte here. If we want to, I can try to track him down right now. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, that's okay. If it suits council, we can move on to item H3 for now. Is that work for everybody? By hands, we'll move on to H3. Okay, and we'll come back to H2 when Mr. Asarte has finished pouring his coffee and all. So item H3, again, it's Ms. Smithers or Dr. Call presenting. It's Advancing Truth and Reconciliation with Stoney Nakoda Nation.
And that would be me as well. So if I can ask maybe the clerk to find Mr. Asarte while I'm doing this presentation, that would be
I think
great.
that's a reasonable request.
Yes, Whitney, I will do that.
Thank you. I am not that good.
Oh, come on now.
Okay, so I will share. Sorry for this mix up. I apologize. And I will share.
Well, we might be just moving a little too quickly for Mr. Asarte.
It does move pretty quick, but you never know. Okay, so I think I'm sharing. Yes, I am. So I don't have a long presentation for this report. It's really just coming back to the Truth and Reconciliation with the Stoney Nakoda Nation. As you will recall, Council had earlier this year passed a motion directing us to put together a scope and a budget for a memorandum of understanding with the Stoney Nakoda Nation. Subsequent to that, Dr. Caudle and I have done some initial work on that. As part of that work, we did have a discussion with Mr. Bill Snow, who is the consultation manager with Stoney Tribal Administration. And it was a very good conversation. And Mr. Snow suggested that while a memorandum of understanding is an important piece of us furthering and formalizing the relationship with the Stoney Nakoda Nation, there are a couple of steps in advance of that he would see necessary as their director of consultation. So one of those steps is really to have key point people for the town to represent the town in discussions with the Stoney Nakoda Nation, to start to build that relationship and just formalize the intent of the town to build that relationship with the nation. And then the other piece of that we had some initial discussions on was just to be able to identify land within the town of Canmore boundaries for ceremony and cultural events with the Stoney Nakoda Nation. Their feeling is, and this makes a lot of sense when you put some thought to it, that without that space for cultural events, it really is hard for them to proceed with the memorandum of understanding, because if we don't have space in the town for telling stories about the traditional knowledge or history or events within the town, it's kind of hard to put together that memorandum of understanding because we don't have the foundation for that in terms of a space within the town. So that kind of summarizes the conversation that Dr. Caudle and I had with Bill Snow. And accordingly, we have developed some recommendations that we need to advance before proceeding with that memorandum of understanding. And those recommendations are, firstly, that the general managers of municipal infrastructure and municipal services, so Dr. Caudle and myself, are the liaisons with the Stoney Nakoda Nation to advance the town's reconciliation efforts with the nation. And then secondly, that administration work with the Stoney Nakoda Nation to identify land within the town of Canmore boundaries that would be appropriate for cultural ceremonies and assist with any necessary agreements for the use of these lands. And that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks very much. When we're talking about lands within the town of Canmore boundaries for cultural ceremonies, I assume that is intended to mean public lands, not private lands?
Yes, so one of the sites that the Stoney Nakoda Nation has expressed interest in is Indian Flats. That is provincial land. So it is one of the things on my radar right now is to reach out to the province to begin discussion on the feasibility of that as an option. So, but generally be looking at town or potentially provincial land for that.
Right, so I mean, there have been cultural ceremonies on those lands in the recent past. I was at a ceremony there only a few years ago. So the Stoney Nakoda do use those lands already as for cultural ceremonies. I'm not sure that Mr. Snow is aware of that, but
Yeah.
so
He is. I believe what he's suggesting is more of kind of a home base, if you will, for the nation to operate out of within the town. He likened it to a comparable site they have within Banff National Park, where it's recognized by Parks Canada as a gathering and cultural space for the Stoney Nakoda. So they're looking at something similar within the town.
Yeah, no, I think it's good to formalize that. It has been semi-formalized. The Stoney Nakoda installed a number of descriptive heritage plaques on that site, and the site, the plaques talk about the historical use of those lands over the centuries. So it is a great location if that's what Mr. Snow's considering. I'm just wondering though about the whether it would be a good idea to tighten up the wording in the motion to be clear that we are intending to look to identify public lands rather than more generic lands as the motion currently reads.
Sure, I think
Okay. Councillor Comfort, this work is largely developed as a result of the motion you brought forward during the ASP discussions. What are your thoughts on this report?
I think it's great that we're moving forward. I think it's entirely appropriate that the positions identified as liaisons are very senior positions in the administration of the town of Canmore, because the nation would expect no less. They want to be respected in that regard and not have, such discussions take place at a lower level of seniority, if you will. So I'm very pleased with this as a start. And the only thing that occurred to me, and it hadn't occurred to me before, is that some of those lands are leased, I believe, from the province to private entities, for example, the Pony Club, and one might want to include them in these discussions.
Yeah, that's right.
At some point, and other leaseholders that I may not be aware of. So just to ward off any problems down the road.
Mm-hmm. You're right. The Stony Flats there that have been used for Stoney Nakoda cultural events is part of the lease for the Pony Club. So I know that they made some arrangement for the more recent event. And in fact, members of the Pony Club came down to share in the event.
Yeah, and I think they'd be very happy to participate. I don't think they would be obstructive, and they would be glad to be included.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that insight. Is there any discussion or questions for Ms. Smithers? Seeing none, thanks very much, Ms. Smithers, for bringing this forward. This time I will move then that council appoint the general managers of municipal infrastructure and municipal services as liaisons with the Stoney Nakoda Nation in advancing the town's reconciliation efforts with the nation, and direct administration to work with the Stoney Nakoda Nation to identify lands within the town of Canmore boundaries that would be appropriate for cultural ceremonies and assist with any necessary agreements for the use of these lands. And I'll move an amendment to that, the second part of that motion, and insert the word public after identify. So it would read, work with Stoney Nakoda Nation to identify public lands within the town of Canmore boundaries. So yeah. So we'll vote on the motion with that additional word, public. Any discussion on the motion? Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. And thank you to administration to bringing this forward prior to the end of the term. I think that this has really been it's important that we have the ability within our own term to be able to sew up and set this relationship up on the right foot. And so I look forward to seeing what future councils are able to build with the nation, and what kind of cultural ceremonies we will be able to observe as settlers over on a public piece of land here in the town of Canmore. Thank you.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor and opposed, motion's carried unanimously. I see Mr. Asarte is here, so we'll move back to item H2, if that suits council, and discuss the bus barn expansion project budget amendment. Mr. Asarte.
Good morning, Mayor and Council. I'm going to share my screen here. And trust that you can see the presentation up there now.
Yeah, we see everything though, rather than just the main slide.
Okay. Is it large enough to be able to read the text?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let me just try this once and see if that helps.
There you go. Yeah, now we're just seeing you. Yeah, we got it.
Thank you. This morning I'm here to speak to the bus barn expansion project budget amendment and propose a motion that council approve an increase to the budget for capital project 7189 bus barn expansion from 200,000 to 300,000 and amend the funding allocation by replacing $100,000 in federal grants with $200,000 in green trip funding. So first, just to help clarify the scope, the project is intended to convert this third bay. And so this is the old waste transfer station building up at Elk Run, where we have our large recycling depot where you can drop off all kinds of basically everything up there, yard waste, batteries, etc. And historically, this was the location where we did waste transfer. So garbage transfer occurred in this facility, recycling transfer occurred there. And a couple of years ago, we had a project when this facility moved to the wastewater treatment plant location south of South Canmore, we saw that as an opportunity to refurbish the building to store the roam buses for our local transit routes. And so a project at that time refurbished two bays worth of storage to store 2 buses. And a third bay has been used by Solid Waste Services as a heated storage space where they store particular materials and equipment that require some to be out of the wet and cold and stored indoors. And so for a number of years, we've been using the facility in this way, and Rome, the Transit Commission approached us looking for additional storage space for a third bus, which we require for our routes currently, and they were having operational issues with storing that bus outside. And so this bay was always intended to be expanded into. We knew at that time we would have to find some storage space for Solid Waste Services, and so the bulk of the scope of this project, though there is some conversion and EV capabilities we're looking for in that third bay, the bulk of the project is to construct this 1,000-foot replacement storage. And so that's the scope. Some of the challenges that, as we've gotten into the details of the project that we've worked through, include a bit more geotechnical study required for this particular location because of this lock block retaining wall. There's quite a grade difference coming across the site. So to level it out, the building actually steps down and has this lower axis. It's about a floor lower than the remainder of the site. And so constructing on top of retaining walls requires geotechnical work. It's a bit of an irregular site. And so where we were in and potentially still hoping to use regular prefabricated building geometry, that proved difficult with all of the constraints on site. Our grant expires in March of 2022, and so we've been working on a timeline to have all expenditure complete by that time. And with the procurement, we know there's challenges out in the market with the impacts of COVID. Everybody's busy. There are a lot of grants out there that have expiries on them right now, and that's intentional, but it is making it challenging to be able to execute these types of projects. So in parallel with coming to council to get a budget amendment, and that budget amendment is using a agreed transfer that we have with the administrator for Green Trip grants. So we're not looking at requiring any additional Town of Canmore dollars. This is through a reallocation of Green Trip funds. We've been working in parallel to get that approval, which we have. We've also been working on looking at the building, talking with suppliers, finding out exactly what happened through that procurement. And so there are a number of steps we're taking to help manage costs going forward, but we do expect to require additional budget for to get completion for this building, and so that's why we're here today. So with that concludes the presentation, and I'll stop the screen share and ask if there are any questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Asarte. So at this time, then there are 3 buses stored on that site. Is that are 3 buses adequate for the Canmore Transit Service? I guess they are, but
yes. So we do have a 4th bus which we've purchased for a seasonal route, and so the expectation is during winter months we will have 3 buses stored indoors, and that will be sufficient for the coming years, several years, for the route improvements and any route improvements that could be approved. There will be a 4th bus with the new electric bus, and that will be stored indoors, and one of the diesel buses will be stored outdoors over the winter, but it won't be in use.
so when we get the 4th bus and then the diesel bus is required to be stored outside, we won't run into the same challenge.
Correct, until we look to expand service to the point where that bus gets put into operation during winter months. So there is a medium-term need to continue to look at bus storage. For now, this has been the way that we've been managing it in the shorter
So
term.
that 4th bus wouldn't be used during the winter months at this time.
Correct.
Got it, right. Okay, thanks very much for bringing the report. Are there questions from members of council? Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Mayor Barman, and thank you, Mr. Asarte, for your presentation. What I understand from this then is if we increase the budget using the Green Trip funding, you may have an opportunity to get more than 1 bid, because at this point in time, you only have 1 bid on this project.
Correct. It was 1 bid, and it wasn't within the budget we had, so that procurement has been canceled. We are in the process of looking at potentially splitting the work to do civil foundation work through an existing contract as the purchasing policy would allow, and that would allow us to then go out for competitive bids on the remaining building portion, and we think with that approach we'll be more successful. And based on discussions with suppliers, we think we'll be more successful in getting multiple bids.
Great, thank you.
Are there other questions, Councillor Hillstead?
Yes, thank you. With the 100,000 from the Infrastructure Canada grants, is that going to be used for anything else, or is it just sits off to the side now?
When the project was put forward, I used the wording federal grants because there were 2 grants that could potentially be used to fund the project. We didn't have approval for Green Trip at that time, and so the other option was ISIP, which had a lower funding percentage, which meant we had a higher town contribution. We did get approval for Green Trip, so that means the ISIP grant that could have been allocated to this project, therefore is available, and it's a longer term window. We have a number of years to spend that grant, so it will be available for a future project.
Thank you.
Other questions? Seeing none, thanks once again for here to present this report, Mr. Asarte. With that, I will move the council approve and increase the budget for capital project number 7189, which is the bus barn expansion from $200,000 to $300,000, and amend the funding allocation by replacing $100,000 in federal grants with $200,000 in Green Trip funding. So discussion on the motion. Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I'll be happy to support this motion. It's a shame that things are getting more expensive, or projects are getting more expensive simply because there's such demand out there because of grant dollars. But at the same time, I'm really pleased that we have these remaining Green Trip funding that we can source to complement the final funding for this project, as well as a creative way at trying to put this project back together. Pardon me. So I'll be happy to support this motion. Thank you.
Further discussion on the motion, Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I too will be happy to support this. I think it's really timely that we access the Green Trip funding, especially since there is a small window of using that funding and that it expires in 2022. If it makes the project more feasible to get more quotes and to get a better competition on it, I think that's also valuable. So thanks for bringing that forward, Mr. Asarte. I will support it.
Councillor Seeley.
I'll also support this. It's important work, and it's nice to get the Green Trip funding. I guess one thing, it seems like we're out of space already. The extra bus will be stored outside, but that seems reasonable, and at least we'll get most of it done. And maybe in the future we can find another home if we need it as we grow.
Further discussion on the motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor and opposed, motion's carried unanimously. Moving on then to item H4, outstanding resolution, the Lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor. Again, Ms. Smithers.
Here you go. I will share my screen. Alrighty. So, hello again, Mayor Borman and members of council. I'm going to present to you now on the Lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor. For background, in 2017, council had approved a motion to direct administration to develop a comprehensive wildlife management plan for the Lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor with a detailed implementation plan. This was, as you may recall, related to a development permit that was in front of council for the enabling works for the Northview Affordable Housing Project in the Palliser lands. So the budget for it, that is why the budget for it was coming from Project 1624, Affordable Housing Land and Policies. Just for reference, the Lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor is situated north of the Trans-Canada Highway, south of the Silvertip Golf Course, and between provincial land to the west and the benchlands and Silvertip Road to the east. So in looking at developing this comprehensive wildlife management plan over the past 4 years, administration has found there's a number of challenges with the motion as it was initially presented to council. These include fragmented ownership within that subject area. There are a handful of major landowners and then quite a few smaller landowners who own properties that back onto that area. There's no consensus on the viability of the area as a corridor. So while the town's recent study from MSIS does show that the corridor is viable for ungulates, the ACA has said in the past that they do not see a conservation value to their portion of that wildlife corridor. And as well, the corridor itself does not have any provincial designation. And then lastly, as we all know, the town has limited expertise when it comes to wildlife management, and it is not within our authority either. So for all of those reasons, actioning this motion has proven to be problematic over the past 4 years. So what we are recommending as an alternative to the motion that is still on the books is that council rescind that motion from 2017 and instead direct administration to assemble a working group consisting of key landowners in that corridor to develop principles for and an approach to shared management of the corridor. And that is simply to recognize that with that fragmented ownership, it's important for us to get to a shared understanding of the value of that open space as a wildlife corridor, and then work collaboratively with all owners in that area to develop a management plan. It's recognizing that this is not something that the town can develop and implement on its own because we're only one player in that area. And then the second recommendation is to direct administration to approve a new capital project in 2021, the Lower Silvertip Human Wildlife Interaction Management Project, with funding up to $100,000 from the General Capital Reserve. And this is simply to try to clean up the way that the project is currently budgeted and have it be more transparent, because currently we have about $100,000 sitting in the Affordable Housing Land Policies project in the planning budget. And this would move it into the sustainability budget in public works and give it a title that more directly corresponds to the actual work to be done. So that is the end of my presentation. And I'm happy to answer questions, and Ms. DeSoto may join me in answering questions, as she has much more of the longer history on this project than I do. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I do recall the discussions in 2017 as we were going through the process to get going on the apartment construction up on the Palliser, and there was certainly at the time concern voiced by some members of the public about the fact that the elk often would come out of the corridor area in Silvertip and graze on the grounds where the apartment building now is. So that was part of what kicked this motion in place in the first instance. So I'm just, we, the community, are certainly highly familiar with the corridors on the other side of the valley, and there's been a lot of discussion about them as of late, and the what went into the creation and the what the expectation is for humans in the corridors. The lower and upper Silvertip corridors there, I'm not that certain because I don't recreate over on that side of the valley, but are there designated trails throughout the wildlife corridors for humans to be recreating on?
Yes, there are some designated trails, and there are also a lot of unsanctioned informal trails that have developed over time.
Yeah, and are those trails, are off-leash dogs permitted on those designated trails or anywhere in the lower upper Silvertip corridor?
I don't believe so, no.
No. My understanding is a lot of Canmore residents regularly run their dogs in the corridors over there, and as you say, we'll use unsanctioned trails. Is that? I think that's sort of understood in Canmore. Nobody has a thought on that. It's a little frustrating, I think, for council to be doing this work and trying to respond to the very real need to manage long-term success on the corridors, and having our residents essentially ignoring the rules in the corridors, which one reason when the town expressed no interest in assuming the conservation lands back when the current conservation trust outfits were trying to offload them. And I guess that was just a bit of a rant. Other questions from Councillor Comfort?
So I just wondered, what's the province's role in this area? Because as I understand it, they sort of hold the authority for wildlife, designating wildlife corridors and management of such. Is that not the case, or?
Well, as I mentioned, this area isn't actually designated provincially as a wildlife corridor. So the province does have a role in terms of being a landowner because they do own some of the land within this corridor area. Some of that is within the provincial park, but some of it isn't. So their primary role is currently as a landowner.
And does the town of Canmore own, are there public lands within that parcel that belong to the town of Canmore?
I will go back up. So the town of Canmore lands, the corridor is the hatched area on your screen. The town of Canmore owns this parcel in blue.
Okay.
And other major landowners would be Stone Creek. They own the part in the green. The province owns these pink areas. Canmore Community Housing owns some of it here. The Alberta Conservation Association owns the parcel on the east. And then there are some properties all along here, some residential parcels that back into that area as well.
Quite the patchwork quilt.
Sure.
Yeah. Or the dog's breakfast.
I don't know what your dog eats for breakfast.
I don't have a dog. Yes, go ahead.
I just wondered, like, we've been at an impasse, is how I would describe it, for some time, a number of years, where the ACA kind of should take authority over this, but they don't have the resources or they don't have the resources to do that. So they've walked away from it. We've walked away from it. And so my question and my concern is, what happens to the wildlife? Is this where this is where the wildlife, the elk, originate that cross the Trans-Canada Highway, right? And put themselves and the public at risk. So would this not be a priority for the province to deal with and the town?
The province has, last I recall, indicated they will be building the wildlife fence along the highway there. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. DeSoto. But that would address, to a large extent, the concern about exists today with the elk randomly wandering out onto the Trans-Canada Highway.
And do we have any detail on that?
No, but just an indication that they will do it. And the other, there was another thought in my mind there. It'll come back to me.
Well,
Councillor Sanford. Oh, Ms. DeSoto, you had something to add?
Well, thank you, Mayor Borman. Just in response to Councillor Comfort's question, I'm not aware of the direction from the province for erecting a fence in that area. I'm not.
I thought that was part of the fencing that was going to be associated to the new wildlife crossing structure.
That wildlife crossing structure is down by the rock cut by Lac des Arcs.
Yeah.
And so the fencing would not extend all the way back into Canmore that I'm sure of.
I always assumed that they were going to extend the fencing to the park, but I guess I'm wrong. It would make.
Yeah, perhaps eventually. I think the only other thing I would add to what Ms. Smithers has already noted around the challenges and the complexity of this issue and the various landowners is that the concept of wildlife corridors is a unique construct that was specifically related to the NRCB decision. So there are no other wildlife corridors in any other community in the province that I'm aware of. So we have identified this corridor through various studies, and it lives in our land mapping, in our land use bylaw and municipal development plan, but it doesn't exist on any other provincial maps that I'm aware of, and there wouldn't be an approval mechanism for it that I'm aware of either. So it really does require the multitude of landowners to collaborate and work together, as Ms. Smithers was outlining.
One other piece of information that's relevant is the recent study that was done, led by the province, if I recall, on the functionality of the lower Silvertip corridor. Can you speak to that, Ms. DeSoto?
Actually, that study was commissioned by ourselves, and Ms. Smithers did speak to it. So it did say that it is functioning in some aspects as an ungulate movement corridor. There were some constraints with it, mainly a large cliff band that forces the elk actually down towards the highway. So there was some suggestion that there could be some land modifications to improve the accessing of the elk through that corridor and into the ACA lands, the purple parcel there. So as elk migrate through the Silvertip owned lands and town owned lands, they hit a large cliff band, which prevents them from getting up into the ACA lands. So in my mind, there is some question on the full functionality across the whole corridor, but the current study clearly said that it is used by elk. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, well, to borrow from something that was put in the next report, it's a wicked problem. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. Was there a camera study done on this land recently? I think the town did something with wildlife cameras to count some of those off-leash dogs that you were talking about, Mayor Barman?
Not to my knowledge, that there were camera studies in the Three Sisters area, but I don't know about on this side of the valley.
Okay.
I believe that the emphasis study that the town did commission related to the corridor was going to be a desktop study. So using the existing information, they wouldn't have set cameras up for it.
Okay. Is there any significant difference between how the lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor is managed compared to the ACA lands? Does anybody know? Is the ACA doing anything actively to manage their purple swath there?
Oh, Lisa, I'll let you answer that one.
Well, there is a management plan that is registered on title for those lands, and part of the concern that the ACA has identified is that they have tried to do some of the management activities, which includes enforcing some of those splinter trails and some of the encroachments from those properties that you can see that back onto there. There's a lot of trails that go right out of people's rear yards, or even landscaping and sort of access into those areas. And they were trying to enforce those and met with quite a lot of public opposition to that enforcement activity. And as they were reviewing that area and saw how much human use there was in that area, that's what led them to believe that there's little conservation value other than open recreation space. And so that is when a couple of years ago, they came to the town of Canmore and asked to transfer that parcel to the town of Canmore as open recreation space. And you'll see the upper purple parcel that isn't in the hatched area, because that actually was, I believe, transferred to the province as part of the wildland park, because that's part of the park boundary. So the province did take sort of ownership of that parcel, and management responsibility, but the province did not have any interest in taking that parcel that's between neighborhoods essentially, and right within the town of Canmore as they saw it. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that's the history I'm aware of with the struggles the ACA had.
Yeah, it's a complex situation because people are living adjacent to all that and they're using to recreate in it. And essentially the point of preserving those lands was to provide wildlife habitat. So it's complex, I understand.
Complex is an understatement. So I'm curious, in the recommendation from admin to assemble a working group specifically consisting of key lower Silvertip wildlife corridor landowners. Do you see any advantage to including, as well as the landowners, some representation from the community in this discussion? And I know it changes the tone and the complexity of the discussions, but to the point, we really need to somehow get buy-in from residents of Canmore to actually understand and respect the corridors. I was thinking that, you know, for instance, this group could include representation from the biosphere or Y2Y, somewhat like the group, the roundtable that was struck not that long ago and focused on slightly different matters. But what's admin's thought on expanding the nature or the makeup of the group to include some community representation?
So we did talk about that initially and go back and forth on it a bit. I think where we're at right now is, as a first step, we need to get a shared understanding and a shared intent from the actual landowners within that corridor area. Because if the landowners don't agree on the extent to which they see management as something that they want to act on, having other stakeholders at the table for that discussion really isn't going to further it. So as a first step, so down the road, yes, they could be involved, but as a first step, we need to sit down with, for example, Stone Creek and the province and the ACA to get to a shared intent of, do we need to actively manage this land? And we being collaborative, the town can't own this. We can't, you know, when Ms. DeSoto was talking about some earthworks that may be required to make part of that corridor accessible, that's not even on town land. So I think there's some big thorny issues in there where the first step is to sit down with those major landowners, get to a shared understanding of what this corridor should be doing and how it can function. And then from there, talk about how do we best go forward with implementing some of those management practices. And for that, yes, I would assume at some point we would bring other stakeholders to the table.
Okay, that's reasonable approach. The suggestion is to create a 2021 capital project. I'm thinking about the discussions we've had around the need to go into initiate a master planning process for the Palliser lands and how this work would tie directly, or was likely to tie directly into that master planning process. So how would you see this flow from this first conversation in informing the master planning process?
It would be an input into that planning process for the Palliser lands when we get to the point that that is a capital project that is resourced and we're actioning.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't see them proceeding sorry to interrupt, I wouldn't see them proceeding at the same time. Well, they could if the budget was there, but they're very much.
Yeah. Well, this is proposing a 2021 capital project, which arguably could be complete by the end of 2021. No, that's not likely. Certainly in 2022. And I think the process for the master planning, Palliser master planning, is not likely to start until after that. So it could be that this work will nicely mesh and inform the next planning work up there. Yeah, so yeah. Okay, are there any other questions from members of council for administration? Any final thoughts from admin on this discussion? Okay, nobody wants to wade into this. Alrighty then. So with that, put a motion on the table that council rescind motion 223-2017, that council direct administration to develop a comprehensive wildlife management plan for the lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor, including a detailed implementation plan with funding up to $100,000 to come from Capital Project 1624. Is there discussion on that rescinding motion? I guess I'll speak to it. This has been such a complex issue for so many years, and just sort of keeps lurking in the background. The community and the town of Canmore and landowners put so much time and thought and consideration into the functionality of the corridors on the south side of the valley, and it seems at times there's almost, I don't know, that this corridor on the north side doesn't really exist. So really is important that as a community we come to terms and grapple with the functionality of the both the upper and lower Silvertip corridors, and I think ultimately the community has to stand up and say, well, this is important to us, and we will respect the intent of those corridors, and we will stop making trails that are not sanctioned, and we'll stop walking our dogs off leash in the corridor. And then another little rant, but we're sending that motion 223 from 2017 is certainly logical first step to then moving forward with the other work that administration is proposing council direct. So I'll support the rescinding motion. Other discussion on that motion, Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I'll support you in your rant, and I'll support this recommendation as well. I do agree that we seem to place all of our attention on one side of the valley and the functionality of those corridors over the other. And I'd also remind the public that these lands are key to trying to move forward with some of our affordable housing and affordability plans moving forward in our community. So we really need to align that work with how we can respect those corridors as they are intended to be respected. On the other side of that, there's a lot of wildlife that exist on that side that are meant to be managed by the provincial government, and they haven't really been doing an awesome job of stepping up to their responsibility either. And much of the public has been asking them to step up to their responsibility based on the elk that they see wandering into the highway. So I support moving forward with this work. It's going to be a tough gig for the next council to grapple with. But I'm hoping that we can get all of those land managers and landowners together to be able to come up with some solutions, and that this is the first step in moving forward with that. Thank you.
And Councillor Comfort.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I wondered, you raised the point that the deadline on this would be a 2021 capital project. So would that mean then that it would be, the conclusion would be expected to be December 31st, 2021?
No, it would just initiate in 2021.
Okay, so we could whip it into the next year, is that right? Or the new council?
I doubt if something like this could be completed by the end of the year.
Myself also, I just, it just, like, it's 8 years now I've been on council, and previous to that, this has been an issue. So it really needs to be properly addressed with the right amount of resources and so forth. And I don't know how that proceeds, but I think this is a good start. And I think administration's recommendation of the working group is a good one. And I guess they have the flexibility to add in other parties as they need to for the discussion. So like Why Do I Say, or other conservation groups, the province. So, but it's not going to be solved in a day, or even in 365 days. It's a tough one. And I'm not sure the will is there for people to solve it, because people just like the freedom of walking their animals or going where they want or biking where they want. And those days are numbered, I'm afraid, and people have to step up and be responsible. You can't wish for something on one hand and not be prepared to take responsibility for your actions on the other. So that's my rant. So that's all.
Yeah, well, it's a good little rant, Councillor. Councillor Seeley, speaking to the motion. Actually, we've got the rescinding motion on the table, but it's okay. People are speaking to all the next motions as well, it would seem.
I do support the recommendation, and I do walk those trails quite regularly with my on-leash dog, and I have no increased compliance. So we do need to do more, and I like including landowners and maybe some residents along the way. It's important work, so I'll support this.
Further discussion, Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I too will support this direction. One thing that we're recognizing is that when we add population to any area, we have to also consider that people like to recreate. And if you're new to the community and you don't really understand what a wildlife corridor is, you might just look at a green space and say, well, that's where I should go. So as we continue to add people on both edges of these corridors, we will see that kind of pressure exacerbated, essentially. But we also need to educate those people. And I think this first conversation that is starting with the landowners is a good place to initiate that conversation. But I think it also has to resonate through the community. And, you know, we may be looking at some community conversations around the use of this land, because it's not just the adjacent landowners that are using these lands, it's much of the community. So it's a big community conversation. And I think this is a good first step, but I think we also have to resonate that out into making people understand what wildlife corridors are for and what we needed them as we established them in the first place. That's what we needed them for. So I think this is going to be a very big conversation that we're starting here.
Councillor Mara.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. I too will support this motion and recommendations. I echo what my fellow councillors have just said, and some ranted, as said. And I think it's important work. Through my first term in council, this subject has sort of had little quips here and there. And I think it's important to get the work started, because as we know, change can come upon us faster than we know. So I truly support this. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so we'll call the question on the first motion, which is the rescinding motion, and then I'll put the other motions on the table, recognizing we've all generally spoken to all the motions, but so to the rescinding motion, call the question. Those in favor and opposed, motion's carried unanimously. And then the motion that council direct administration to assemble a working group consisting of a league of key lower Silvertip wildlife corridor landowners to develop principles for and an approach to shared management of the corridor, and approve a new 2021 capital project, lower Silvertip human wildlife interaction management project, with funding up to $100,000 from the general capital reserve. Again, I think we've all spoken to that motion to some extent as well, but if further thoughts anybody would like to express on that specific motion, look to council. Seeing none, I'll call the question on that second motion. Those in favor? And opposed, motion's carried unanimously. And thanks again to administration for doing the work on this and bringing it forward to council. We do need to bring some sort of understanding resolution to the issue on the corridors on the north side of the valley. So this will help. Looking at item H5, short-term rental accommodation next steps. And this should be a pretty quick and easy conversation. So Ms. DeSoto.
Thank you, Mayor Borman, and I'm going to share my screen. Okay, I'm assuming you can all see that.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. So thank you, Mayor Borman, members of council. This is another report that's addressing an outstanding resolution similar to that last one around the Silvertip Wildlife Corridor. We have a resolution action list, as you know, that we share with you every month at Committee of the Whole. And our oldest resolution on that list is one from 2015, so even before your term. And it's regarding future steps on looking at short-term rental accommodation in the town of Canmore. It's administration's desire to clean up that resolution action list prior to the election so that we have some clear next steps to take with the next council and so that we can work efficiently to resolve these issues. So to that end, the report today outlines a process by which we're asking you to rescind the current motion on the books, motion number 158-2015, and then to replace it with a new motion that would direct administration to confirm with council a desired approach for regulation and management of short-term vacation rentals in residential neighborhoods. And so by way of background on this, it's as you'll see from, I think it's almost 4 pages of background and history in the decision report. There's a long and complex history on this issue with different councils providing different direction through the decades. And I'm not going to go bullet by bullet through that history, but we'll look at it in very broad strokes in sort of large chunks. So up until 1990, for the first decade that we were looking at this through the up until 2000 through the 1990s, we were seeing some homeowners start to rent their homes out nightly, and neighborhoods were pushing back, and the council of the day tried to ban this approach through limiting length of stay in the land use bylaw. And specifically, the town of Canmore took one property owner through to the Court of Appeal, and we won an injunction against that property owner in the year 2000 that prevented them from further renting out their home. And so the intent of during that decade was really to not allow short-term rentals in residential neighborhoods. For the next 10 plus years, we wrestled with a new use called tourist homes, and we defined that use in the land use bylaw with sort of a hybrid use that allowed it was a residential use, and we, the council and administration of the time said, well, we're going to allow short-term rentals in Canmore in some residential neighborhoods on a go-forward basis. So typically in new residential areas. So the tourist home use was a permitted use that was allowed in Kananaskis Way, and some small areas of Silvertip, and it was proposed in some of the resort areas of Three Sisters. It's been permitted in the areas of Spring Creek Mountain Village. So we have quite a few tourist home units in town, and those homes are taxed at a higher rate, and owners are permitted, so supplemental decisions of supplemental councils based on feedback from residents. We allow owners of those units to sign declarations saying they're only using their tourist home unit for personal use. And if they sign those declarations, then they get taxed at the lower rate. So that was an approach to allowing short-term rentals in residential neighborhoods. Despite that approach, it was still very lucrative. And what we were seeing is that residents in other neighborhoods wanted the option to rent out their homes for short-term stays. And we embarked on a period between 2014 and 2016 where we did a number of studies. We struck a property tax task force. We conducted a tourist home accommodation study. We did a visitor accommodation review. We had multiple reports to the council, but no meaningful changes in approach in either taxation of tourist homes or in permitting of short-term rentals occurred. And so following that, their tourism really did continue to grow in Canmore, and the issues around conflicts with tourists using residential homes in residential neighborhoods ballooned again, and we started to see increasing complaints from neighbors whose potential homes in neighborhoods were being used as illegal tourist homes. And I believe it was this council and potentially the previous council that approved additional resources in our planning department and bylaw department to step up enforcement of illegal tourist homes. And so we have taken active efforts, including searching online websites to look for those who are renting out their homes illegally. And most recently, we've started at an effort in late 2020 and most of this year to work with the community around a community conversation on the future of tourism. And that conversation is important for a number of reasons, and I'll get to those in a couple of slides. So with that background and history, the challenge that we've been having throughout the decades is that the regulation of short-term rentals is complicated by competing and very valid objectives around affordability, community values, taxation, fairness, and equity, and competition within business sectors. So for example, those who own small inns or visitor accommodation units, which, as you know, some condominiumized hotels are actually zoned commercially, and property owners who own those units want to see taxation fairness between short-term rentals, whether that be tourist homes or short-term rentals provided in residential neighborhoods. And so we just have not been successful in defining that problem and creating a solution that would meet all of these competing interests. And so we've defined a wicked problem. You can look that up on Wikipedia, and you'll find that it is often referred to as in municipalities or in governments where you have these competing yet valid objectives, and there is no clear path forward. So the current motion on the books is one we've struggled to satisfy to council's or satisfaction. So what we're proposing and what we had suggested to council at a strategic planning session when we were debriefing our land use bylaw approach was that we can't really pick up this conversation with the community until we have clarity from the community around the future vision for tourism in our community and what they want to see and hold on to as community values. So we wanted to allow the tourism task force conversation to unfold and conclude before we started to really step into looking at short-term rentals again in residential neighborhoods. So the tourism task force has been struck. They've been holding conversations with the community around the future of tourism in Canmore. We've conducted workshops, interviews, surveys. We've looked at what values and amenities need to be protected in the community and how we can start to build broad-based citizen support for tourism. And while we haven't specifically looked at the question of short-term rentals in residential neighborhoods, we have really talked about what's important to preserve and protect as a community in order to get that broad-based support for tourism. And the consultant leading that work, Stormy Lake, will be presenting their findings to council on October 5th. And we hope that to share those findings with the next council and work with them to help define what the next steps should be and what what we want to do around short-term rentals, continued enforcement, continued prohibition, or some form of permitting system. So our proposal again is that you rescind the current motion on the books, which is 6 years old now, and that you replace it with a new motion that directs us to confirm with council that desired approach for regulation and management of short-term vacation rentals in residential neighborhoods. And that was the end of my presentation, and I will stop sharing and see if there are.
Thanks. That was very neat and well succinct summary of the last 20, 25 years of trying to deal with this wicked problem. And I'll be perfectly honest. I'm happy to bow out of this discussion, let the next council try to wrestle it to the ground, because it's been very challenging. I don't have any specific questions for Ms. DeSoto on her report. Are there members of council with questions at this time? I don't see any.
Councillor McCallum has one.
Oh, sorry, Councillor McCallum. Thought she was just fluffing her hair.
No, I actually just wanted to, and I know the answer to this question, but I just want to affirm publicly that at this point, illegal short-term accommodation in residential areas outside of those that are permitted are just not permitted. And that we're going to continue to regulate that approach as we have through our stepped up resources through the planning and bylaw departments.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Sure. Okay. I just wanted to make sure. I think that that's really, yeah, that's all I wanted to confirm. Thanks.
So just to sort of confirm my memory of this recent part of it, in 2017, when we approved an additional position in planning department in order to enforce issues related to short-term rentals, that position was filled for 2 years, is that right?
Yes.
Right. My recollection, strong recollection, is that it was for the first time, perhaps we really had a lot of success in addressing the issue and found far less in the way of illegal short-term rentals. That's my recollection. I doubt if you would disagree with that, would you?
No, I don't disagree. I think there was a lot of press and profile around certain fines and enforcement actions that had good success.
Yeah, there were a number of owners of units that were being rented illegally that fought us in court, and my recollection is the town won all of those challenges. I guess once again, just thinking aloud, I'm hoping that the next council takes full grasp of this and addresses it both immediately and applies the necessary resources to addressing the problem. We're never gonna get anywhere if all we do is wring our hands about it. We need council, in my opinion, will need to approve resources to administration in order to continue to address this problem. Are there questions for Ms. DeSoto at this time? Seeing none, thanks very much for putting this report together. You must have had a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, it was an interesting walk back in time, that's for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, walk down memory lane. So with that, I will move the council rescind motion 158-2015. The council directed administration to undertake a public consultation process to determine if land use bylaw should be amended to allow residential dwellings to be used for short-term tourist home rentals subject to clear regulations. And that prior to the end of June 2022, administration be directed to confirm with the next council the desired approach for regulation and management of short-term vacation rentals in residential neighborhoods. And in putting that double-barreled motion on the table, it occurs to me there may be councillors who would prefer to separate and vote on the rescinding motion separately from the second one. If there's anybody who'd like to do that, just let me know. It appears that everybody's comfortable to speak to both motions at the same time. So I'll certainly speak in support of both motions. In a sense, this is clearing the slate and allowing the next council to have a fresh start and addressing these issues, and the next council won't be trying to respond to the issue using some of the direction that previous councils explored. And I really hope that there'll be quite a bit of discussion about this issue during the upcoming election campaign period. It is just like the last issue we're talking about, the use and the proper use of the wildlife corridors. This is a key and critical part of our community that really has to be wrestled to the ground. It is the question of short-term rentals within residential neighborhoods. So I'm happy to bring my support to both these motions, and I'll look forward to seeing where it goes post-election. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I'm sorry that we're pushing this issue down the road yet again. It's a very complex one because we have several resort properties that have been designated for this purpose that have yet to be built. We don't have the anchor resorts that we were counting on from 20 years ago. And so the community is kind of turning inward on itself. And this is a problematic situation that we're in. We have become primarily a residential community, as we see from our tax base. And now we've got to deal with the consequences of growing in a certain way that wasn't exactly how we expected to do 20 years ago. So now we're growing in a residential format, and we're trying to rejig that residential format into something else. So I think this is going to be a very difficult conversation. And as we get more and more into entrenched residentially, we're going to be facing a very significant challenge with this. And until such time as the anchor resorts that we've been counting on for 20 years get built, with the requisite amount of staff accommodation that is supposed to go with those developments, we're going to be facing this residential challenge. So I think this is a significant conversation for the next council to have. I agree. We're dealing with a completely new set of variables now. And I think that council is going to have to look very closely at what the situation is that we're in now that's accumulated over a long period of time. So I will support this, and I look forward to continuing in this conversation.
Further discussion on the motions, Councillor Comfort?
I also will support this motion. I don't think this is related to, well, maybe somewhat to the issues of the resorts that were promised not being built. But I think it's a clear question of just human greed. A single night's accommodation for a 1 bedroom in a short-term rental can be as much as 2 weeks or more rent, or mortgage payment could equal a mortgage payment. So I don't think it's an issue of not having built enough accommodation, visitor accommodation. And the temptation will always be there. I think we found when we started enforcement that the fines exceeded the profit that could be made, and that was why it was successful. And that would always be the case. I'm sorry to be so cynical about human nature, but I am. So I will also, that observation being made, I will support this recommendation, and best of luck to the new council solving this one.
Councillor Comfort, to your point, I will note that when we approved the increased fine structure back in 2017, 2018, it had really strong success. When the fine was, what was it, $2,500 for the first offense and $5,000 the second, suddenly people were obeying the law. So yeah, it's too bad we have to resort to a big stick, but it seems to be human nature. Who else wanted to speak to the motion? Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. And thank you to administration for providing this history lesson. Actually, it's really interesting to look back on how this particular issue has changed and morphed over nearly a 20-year period. I think that if we hadn't found ourselves in the middle of a global pandemic, we might have had an opportunity to perhaps address this. But I believe that the pandemic has also brought this more front and center with regards to the amount of visitation that we've seen, intense visitation that we've seen locally in the last 20 months. What this really speaks to is about the commodification of housing. And, council has on one hand said, no, we do not want to see more any illegal tourist homes. But at the same time, we've continued to allow illegal tourist homes to develop in residential neighborhoods that are like working class neighborhoods too. So it feels like we're saying one thing on one hand and another in the other. However, I think that the Tourism Task Force will be able to provide the next council with the fresh direction that they're looking for in terms of this particular issue. I also think that the nature of tourist homes and how they are financed has taken a real about face in the last 20 months as well. And so residential homes that are zoned tourist home are zoned or are valued at a much higher rate than an actual residential unit next door to it, which is also problematic. And as Councillor Comfort has pointed out, it just sort of seems to incent greed. So I am happy to support this motion. I think a fresh council will be able to put a fresh face on this particular issue and hopefully grapple it to the ground. We know that it impacts our, just even the tourist home issue itself has an impact within our own administration in terms of the work it provides. And I think that we just need to decide as a community whether we want to be a community or not. So I look forward to seeing what the next council will do with this, and I will be happy to support this. Thank you.
Councillor Seeley.
I'll also support this, and in my travels, I noticed that this isn't just a Canmore issue, it's a Canadian issue. It's right across the country. We're losing our housing assets, and I think this is something that we need to define and regulate and protect affordability, especially in Canmore. We're having an issue we've had for a long time, and yeah, I look forward to discussions as they move forward, but it's worth taking a fresh look at for sure.
Councillor Hillstead.
I too will support this motion. As has been stated, I think we'll actually just have more, we have a lot of information from our long history dealing with this, but we'll have more information and clearer direction with the tourism task force. And that will help give us a fresh perspective on this and, see which way we want to go as a community. There's a lot of, again, because it is such a wicked problem, there are a lot of options and there's a lot of ways that could potentially make it better one way or the other, but with all those, they also have different consequences. So I think it is the right decision to let this go for now and let the next council take a stab at it. And hopefully we'll have some good ideas and hopefully things will get figured out, but it is a tricky situation. So all we can do is hope that we figure it out eventually.
Yeah. If there's no further discussion then on the two motions, call the question. Those in favor and opposed, motion's carried unanimously. I don't think there's too many people watching this meeting. Hopefully the people that have thrown their hat in the ring and are candidates for election will take some time to watch this meeting online afterwards. There's two very important issues that we've discussed today, and if they're elected to council, they're going to have to deal with those issues. I think as long as everybody's okay, I'm going to just push through and finish the agenda. We only have one last item on the agenda. No point in taking a break at this point. So I'll ask, I guess, Ms. DeSoto to present the report on Kananaskis Improvement District-Canmore Fire Rescue Agreement.
Yes, thanks again, Mayor Borman, members of council. I'm here on behalf of Sally Cottle, who did the heavy lifting on getting this first response fire and rescue agreement with the Kananaskis Improvement District drafted and negotiated, along with Chief Gaylor, who was also at the negotiation table. So I do have a very quick presentation to share. Which I'll do right now. Okay, so today I am before you to request that council approve the Kananaskis Improvement District and Town of Canmore first fire rescue agreement as presented. And a little bit of background in history. You'll recall that the Municipal Government Act requires all municipalities that share a common border to enter into an intermunicipal collaborative framework agreement, or an ICF. And we had council approve an ICF with the Municipal District of Bighorn and also with KID earlier this year. Or sorry, that would have been, earlier this year. And as part of that ICF, there was this one area that we had not yet come to agreement on how we might collaborate. And so the ICF gave a deadline of August 30th to conclude negotiations. And if we weren't able as parties to conclude negotiations, then we would be required to enter into mandatory mediation. So I'm pleased to say that the parties were able to conclude negotiations, and what you see before you and is attached to the request for decision report is the negotiated agreement. Because it has been negotiated, if there were any desired changes, etc., I would need to take those back to the negotiating table. Because they are also being presented to the KID Council for approval. Just by way of discussion, there are a number of key terms included in the agreement that I wanted to highlight for you. So we are, through this agreement, we will respond in a first response capacity. So dispatch will dispatch Canmore Fire and Rescue directly to respond to the areas within those, in the maps attached to the agreement. So really that's around a 50 meters on either side of Highway 742, which goes up from the Nordic Center all the way to Engadine Lodge. And the response that we would be responsible for is fire and limited rescue. And that limitation is vehicle extraction or shore-based aquatic rescue. So the definitions, we're trying to clarify that it's not all rescue services. And it's not in all areas of the KID either. It's within those limited areas. Those areas also include the Nordic Center facility zone, which is shown on a separate map in the agreement. But to be clear, the rescue activities such as rope angle rescue or water rescue are the responsibility of Kananaskis Public Safety, and we are hoping to be able to negotiate a separate agreement with them as a separate provincial agency, but they are not governed by the Kananaskis Improvement District, so they're not party to this agreement. There are really minimal financial impacts. I mean, we do respond to those areas and historically have responded without financial compensation, but this agreement will ensure that the town is appropriately compensated for any of the services that are provided, and will be compensated based on those hourly rates that are set through the master fee schedule. It also addresses any liability issues. There has been ongoing concern from an insurance perspective and a liability perspective if we were to provide service beyond our municipal boundaries outside of an agreement, whether we would incur any additional liability, and that this would ensure that that doesn't occur. And should we be responding in additional capacities or not be satisfied with the agreement, this agreement provides for a formal discussion and dispute resolution process that will serve us into the future. So that's really the end of my presentation. Looking for council to approve that agreement as presented, and happy to take any questions should you have any.
Thanks very much for presenting, and thanks to Dr. Cottle for doing the initial work to bring this agreement forward. It's important we have this agreement in place, particularly recognizing that there has been services provided in the past without any payment, and it's also it's important that we clear up any question around insurability and whatnot. So it's pretty straightforward agreement. I don't personally have any questions in regards to the terms of the agreement. Just pleased that we're bringing it forward. Councillor Comfort, you have a question?
Yes, I just wondered about training, joint training. If there was anything, I did not, I confess, go through the agreement carefully, and I just wondered, was that addressed in the agreement?
No, not to my knowledge. It wasn't. This is strictly around response and who would be first response and how we get compensated for that response. So no, it does not address training.
And where would that be addressed? Where would they, the different services come to an agreement on training?
Could I ask Councillor Comfort, that you provide some clarity on that question? Are you thinking about Kananaskis Improvement District personnel being trained with our personnel? Or
well, just joint training. I think if we're talking about responding jointly to, excuse me, to an incident, that kind of training might be very helpful.
So that's a good question. We do have a mutual aid agreement with our community partners, which include the MD Bighorn and the town of Banff, that, you know, we will respond, and part of the incident command system that's being used across Alberta and really across North America ensures that all first responders are sort of trained in the ICS system, so that it doesn't matter who's command on a scene. You know, it could be RCMP, for example, that's command on a scene of an emergency, but that the language spoken and used by all the responding agency is the same. So part of that happens independently in the individual training that occurs for individual service providers. We have on occasion done joint emergency response training with the town of Banff, for example, but that is something that you know, it is more exceptional than something we do on an annual basis, for example.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that's good. Thanks.
Other questions for Ms. DeSoto? Seeing none, thanks very much for presenting this report.
Thank you.
And with that, I'll move the council approve the Kananaskis Improvement District, KID, and Town of Canmore Fire Rescue Agreement as presented. And I'll speak in support of the motion. It's good to have this detail tidied up. Yeah, if we're going to be providing services for KID, it's important that we have an agreement in place. So happy to support this motion. For the discussion, Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I too would be happy to support this. And I think it's good that the provincial government has mandated these arrangements be made with neighboring municipalities. I think it clarifies our relationships. And I also think that larger municipalities like ours get the proper agreements and are appropriately compensated for the services that we provide. So I really think that these agreements that we've been rolling out with our neighboring municipalities and improvement districts and MDs have been very valuable to us. So I appreciate all the work that administration has done on this, and I think this is a very good outcome from that direction. So I will support it.
For the discussion on the motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor and opposed, motion's carried unanimously. And if I'm not mistaken, that will bring us back to motion to adjourn. So I'll move the council be adjourned at this time. Those in favor